So there's this man, can't read, can't write, not in English, not in any language, and he spends 12 years of his life alone, trying to do something that nobody in recorded history had ever done before. His wife thinks he's lost his mind. His neighbours think he's practicing witchcraft. They burn his work. He keeps going, and in 1821 he finishes. He gives his entire people a way to read and write their own language. Within 5 years, the Cherokee have a higher literacy rate than the white settlers surrounding them. They have their own newspaper, their own constitution. They take their case to the Supreme Court and they win. And none of it matters. They lose everything anyway. If these help you sleep, like or subscribe. And drop where you're listening from in the comments. I'm always curious. All right, get comfortable. This one goes back a long way. Picture this. You're waking up in the southern Appalachian Mountains. Not the Appalachians you might visit today with paved roads and visitor centres. This is before any of that existed. Before the United States. Before the colonies. Before any European had ever set foot on this land. Your eyes open to soft grey light filtering through a thatched roof. The air smells like wood smoke and damp earth, and something cooking over a fire. Outside your winter house, mist clings to the mountain peaks like the mountains themselves are breathing. Rolling green valleys stretch in every direction, cut through by rivers so clean you can see the stones at the bottom. This is Cherokee territory, 40,000 square miles of it. Everything that would one day become North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, parts of Alabama, South Carolina, Virginia and Kentucky. Not wilderness, not untamed land. A carefully managed empire of towns and farms and hunting grounds, all connected by trails that follow the curves of the earth like veins through a leaf. And you're Cherokee, one of the Anivia, the principal people. The thing about Cherokee society that most people don't understand is how sophisticated it was. We tend to imagine Native Americans as simple people living simple lives. That's not what this was, not even close. Take the town you're living in. It's built around a central mound, a massive flat-topped structure made of earth, rising toward the sky. On top of that mound sits the council house, a huge circular building that can hold several hundred people. 7 sides, actually. 1 section for each of the 7 clans. The council house isn't just a meeting hall, it's the political heart of everything. This is where decisions get made, where ceremonies happen, where the sacred fire burns. That fire has been burning for as long as anyone can remember. It never goes out. Priests tend it day and night. If that fire dies, something in the spirit of the people dies with it. Surrounding the council house are the homes, not the simple structures you might imagine. Each family has 2 houses, a summer house that's open and airy, built to catch the breeze, and a winter house, smaller, partially underground, with thick walls of wattle and daub, basically mud and clay woven around wooden frames. In the centre of your winter house, there's a fire pit. The smoke curls up and escapes through a hole in the roof. It's warm in here, comfortable. Outside the town along the riverbanks are the fields. Corn, beans and squash grow together in a system so clever it took the Cherokee centuries to perfect. The cornstalks grow tall. The beans climb up them and fix nitrogen in the soil, making it richer. The squash spreads out at the bottom, its big leaves shading the ground to keep moisture in and weeds out. 3 sisters, they call it. An ingenious system that feeds thousands. But here's the part that would have shocked any European who encountered it. The part that challenges everything they thought they knew about how society should work. The women run everything, not figuratively, literally. Cherokee society is matrilineal. That means everything passes through the mother. Your clan, your identity, your place in the world, all of that comes from your mother's side. When you're born, you belong to your mother's clan. Your mother's brother, not your father, is your most important male role model. The home belongs to your mother. The fields belong to your mother. The children belong to your mother. If a marriage ends, the husband doesn't take anything. He just leaves, goes back to his mother's house. All property stays with the wife and her clan. Women aren't just heads of households. They're decision makers. They choose who the tribe goes to war with. A council of women called the Women's Council of Clan Representatives holds real political power, and at the top there's a position called Beloved Woman. She has a vote in the General Council. She can decide the fate of prisoners of war. She speaks, and people listen, because the Cherokee believe the Great Spirit sometimes speaks through her. Try explaining that to a European in the 1700s, when women in England couldn't own property, couldn't vote, couldn't sign legal documents without their husband's permission. The Cherokee looked at European society and thought those people were the backwards ones. Now the clans. This is where it gets really interesting. There are 7 of them. 7 clans that make up the entire Cherokee nation. And your clan isn't just a family name, it's the law. The Wolf clan is the largest. Warriors come from the Wolf clan, war chiefs, protectors. They're fierce and loyal, and they're the only ones allowed to kill a wolf. There are special ceremonies for that, special medicines. The Deer clan produces the fastest runners, the messengers. When news needs to travel from one town to another, across mountains and through valleys, the Deer clan carries it. They're also the keepers of the deer. Even though they hunt deer for food, they care for the animals deeply. After a successful hunt, they perform ceremonies of thanks. They ask the deer spirit for forgiveness. The Bird clan are messengers too, but between earth and heaven. They're the keepers of sacred feathers. Medicine people often come from this clan. They interpret dreams and observe the patterns of birds for meaning. The Longhair clan, sometimes called the Wind clan or the Twister clan, are known for their elaborate hairstyles. They walk with this particular proud gait, twisting their shoulders with each step. Peace chiefs come from this clan, diplomats, negotiators. They're also the clan that adopts strangers and orphans into Cherokee society. The Blue clan makes medicine from plants, herbalists, healers. They know which plants cure which ailments. That knowledge has been passed down for generations. The Wild Potato clan are the gatherers. They know every edible root and plant in the forest. In hard times, when the harvest fails, the Wild Potato clan keeps people fed. And the Paint clan. They make the sacred red paint used in ceremonies and war. Artists come from this clan. Spiritual leaders, medicine men. It's the smallest and most secretive clan. Here's the thing that really mattered though. Marriage within your own clan is forbidden. Absolutely forbidden. Clan members are considered brothers and sisters. Marrying within your clan, or within your father's clan, is incest. And the punishment for incest is death. Not death at the hands of the government. Death carried out by your own clan members. Your own family would be responsible for executing you. The clans also handle justice in another way. If someone from the Wolf clan kills someone from the Deer clan, whether by accident or on purpose, balance has to be restored. The killer's clan has to provide someone to be executed. Doesn't have to be the actual killer. Could be anyone from that clan. Because it's not about revenge. It's about cosmic balance. About keeping harmony between the clans. This might sound brutal to us, but think about what it creates. A society where every clan is deeply invested in the behavior of its members, where your actions have consequences not just for you, but for everyone connected to you. It creates accountability at a level most societies never achieve. And then there's Gadugi, communal work for the good of the village. If someone's crops fail, the community helps them. If someone's house burns down, everyone rebuilds it together. Orphans are taken in, the elderly are cared for, visitors are welcomed. Nobody is ever truly alone. Picture your morning in this world. You wake before dawn. The fire in your winter house has burned down to embers, but the room is still warm. You push aside the deerskin blanket and step outside into the cold mountain air. Mist hangs everywhere. You can barely see the other houses through it. You make your way down to the river. The water is cold, really cold. But this is important. This is going to water, a daily practice of spiritual cleansing. You wade in, facing east toward where the sun will rise. You pray. You ask the Creator to wash away impurities, both physical and spiritual, to prepare you for the day ahead. The water is so cold it almost hurts. But there's something clarifying about it. Something that wakes you up in a way that nothing else can. When you step out of the river, your skin is tingling. You feel alive. You feel clean. You feel connected to something bigger than yourself. Back in the town, the day's work begins. The women head to the fields with their hoes and baskets. The corn is getting tall now. It'll need tending. The beans are climbing the stalks, their leaves reaching for the sun. The men prepare for the hunt. Deer have been spotted in the valley to the north. The hunters fast and pray before they go. They ask the spirits of the deer for permission to take their lives. This isn't just politeness. It's necessary. The Cherokee believe that animals have spirits too, and those spirits must be respected. By midday, the sun has burned off the mist. The mountain stands sharp and green against a bright blue sky. Children play near the council house, their laughter echoing off the mound. Older women weave baskets from river cane, intricate geometric patterns emerging under their skilled fingers. These baskets aren't just functional, they're beautiful, decorated with natural dyes in colours that seem to glow. Inside the council house, the elders are meeting. There's talk of trade with the neighbouring tribe, talk of the harvest, talk of the upcoming green corn ceremony, the most important religious event of the year. That ceremony marks the beginning of harvest season. Old fires will be extinguished. Old debts will be forgiven. The community will be reborn. As the afternoon fades into evening, the hunters return. They've been successful. A large buck, enough meat for many families. The women take over, skinning and butchering with expert precision. Nothing is wasted. The meat will be dried and stored. The hide will be tanned into soft leather for clothing and moccasins. The bones will be carved into tools and ornaments. This is the rhythm of life in the Cherokee world. Planting and harvest, hunt and feast, ceremony and celebration, birth and death and birth again. The past, present and future woven together in a continuous thread. This world has existed for thousands of years. The Cherokee have lived in these mountains for so long that their origin stories begin here. Some scholars think their ancestors migrated from the Great Lakes region in the distant past, but more recent evidence suggests the Cherokee have been in the Appalachians for at least 4,000 years, maybe longer. Their language belongs to the Iroquoian family, which is interesting because the Iroquois live way up north, around the Great Lakes. At some point, thousands of years ago, these peoples must have been connected, but the Cherokee have been separate for so long that their language is barely recognizable to their northern cousins. By the year 100, the Cherokee's ancestors were building platform mounds and complex towns. By 1500, They had nearly 100 autonomous towns, each with its own council house, its own sacred fire, its own version of the dual government, a white government for peace, led by the peace chief, a red government for war, led by the war chief. This is not a primitive society. This is a civilization, complex, sophisticated, ancient, and deeply connected to the land they call home. And they have no idea what's coming. Somewhere far to the east, across an ocean the Cherokee have never seen, ships are being built. Men with strange weapons and stranger diseases are gathering. They're looking for gold, looking for glory, looking for new worlds to conquer. The year is 1539. In Spain, a man named Hernando de Soto is planning an expedition to the New World. He's heard rumours of cities of gold somewhere in the interior of this strange land across the sea. He's gathering an army, hundreds of soldiers, horses, war dogs, weapons the Cherokee have never imagined. In the mountains of present-day Tennessee and North Carolina, life continues as it has for centuries. The sacred fires burn. The women tend their fields. The children laugh and play near the council houses. The elders pray and make decisions and pass down the old stories. Nobody in those peaceful mountain towns has any idea that their world is about to change forever. That within a few years, strangers will arrive bringing weapons that kill from a distance, bringing animals larger than any the Cherokee have ever seen, bringing invisible killers that will sweep through their towns like wildfire, killing 9 out of every 10 people they touch. The mist still clings to the mountains in the morning. The rivers still run clear and cold. The corn still grows tall alongside the beans and squash. But the clock is ticking, and once it runs out, nothing will ever be the same again. The year is 1540. You're working in the fields outside your town when someone comes running. A messenger from the Deer clan, out of breath, eyes wide with something you've never seen before. Fear. Real fear. There are strangers coming, he says, from the south. Hundreds of them. They ride on top of enormous animals bigger than any elk, faster than any deer. They wear shining shells that arrows can't pierce. They carry sticks that make thunder and kill from a distance. And they have dogs. Huge dogs. Dogs trained to hunt men. You don't really understand what he's describing. How could you? Nothing in your experience has prepared you for this. The Cherokee have been trading and fighting and living in these mountains for thousands of years, and in all that time nothing like this has ever happened. The strangers arrive a few days later. Hernando de Soto, Spanish conquistador. He's already torn through Florida and Georgia, leaving a trail of burned villages and enslaved people behind him. He's looking for gold, cities of gold, like the ones Cortez found in Mexico. He's convinced they're here somewhere, hidden in these misty mountains. He doesn't find gold. What he finds are Cherokee towns, farms, granaries full of corn, women and children who can be captured and used as slaves and guides, men who resist and have to be killed. The Cherokee fight back. Of course they do. But here's the thing about fighting Europeans in 1540. Your bows and war clubs, weapons that have served your people for centuries, are almost useless against men in steel armour. Their horses let them move faster than any warrior on foot. Their guns can kill you before you get close enough to fight, and their dogs, trained mastiffs and greyhounds bred for war, can run down anyone who tries to flee. De Soto cuts through Cherokee territory like a knife. He takes what he wants, burns what he doesn't, moves on, and then he's gone, back to wherever he came from. The Cherokee bury their dead, rebuild what they can, try to make sense of what just happened. Life goes on. The sacred fires still burn. The corn still grows. Maybe that was it. Maybe those strange men will never come back. But DeSoto left something behind. Something invisible. Something that will kill more Cherokee than all his soldiers and guns and dogs combined. Disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. The Cherokee have no names for these things because they've never existed here before. The people of the Americas have been separated from Europe and Asia for thousands of years. Their immune systems have never encountered these diseases. They have no resistance. None. It starts slow. A fever here, a cough there. Then the spots appear. Red at first, then filling with fluid, then bursting and crusting over. The sick person's skin looks like it's rotting while they're still alive. The fever climbs, delirium sets in, and then death, sometimes within days of the first symptoms. Imagine watching your family get sick, one by one. Your mother first, then your children, then your aunts and uncles and cousins. The medicine men try everything they know. The old ceremonies, the sacred herbs, going to water, that cleansing ritual that has healed so many ailments before. But the cold river water that usually brings clarity and health seems to make smallpox worse. People come out of the water shivering, their fevers spiking, their bodies giving out. Nothing works. People keep dying, whole families, whole clans, whole towns. You walk through villages where everyone is dead, houses standing empty, food still in the pots, fires burned down to cold ash. Dogs wandering between the bodies, confused, waiting for owners who will never wake up. The smell is something you'll never forget. Sweet and rotten and wrong. The numbers are hard to comprehend. Before contact, the Cherokee population might have been as high as 100,000 people. By the time the epidemics run their course, maybe 10,000 are left, maybe less. 90% of the population gone. In a generation or two, 9 out of every 10 people you knew are dead. Think about what that does to a society. The clan system, that intricate web of relationships and responsibilities that held everything together, starts to unravel. Entire clans are wiped out. The old people who carried the stories and the knowledge die before they can pass it on. The ceremonies can't be performed properly because the people who knew how to perform them are gone. The sacred fires go out in some towns because there's no one left to tend them. The survivors are left wandering through a world that doesn't make sense anymore. The old explanations don't work. The Cherokee believe that illness came from spiritual imbalance, that the right ceremonies and medicines could restore health. But no ceremony stops this. No medicine helps. People just keep dying, and the survivors are left to wonder what they did wrong. What offense against the spirits could possibly deserve this? This is the world the Cherokee are living in when the English arrive. By the late 1600s, English colonists have established themselves along the Atlantic coast. They want land, sure, but they also want something else: deer skins. Back in Europe, deer leather is in high demand. It's used for gloves, book bindings, all sorts of luxury goods. The colonists can't hunt enough deer themselves to meet the demand. But the Cherokee can. The Cherokee are expert hunters. They know the land, they know where the deer are, and they're willing to trade. The deal is simple. The Cherokee bring deer skins to the English trading posts. The English give them European goods in return: guns, metal tools, cloth, and alcohol. At first, it seems like a good arrangement. The guns make hunting easier. The metal tools are better than stone. The cloth is warm and durable. The Cherokee adapt quickly, incorporating these new things into their lives. They become middlemen, trading between the English and other tribes further inland. But there's a cost. There's always a cost. The old economy, based on hunting for food and growing crops for your community, starts to shift. Now men spend more time hunting for profit. They're not just killing enough deer to feed their families, they're killing as many as they can, because deer skins mean trade goods, and trade goods mean wealth and power. Between 1699 and 1715, the Cherokee are exporting over 50,000 deer skins a year just to Charleston. By the 1730s, that number has tripled. 150,000 skins a year. The deer population starts to collapse. Hunters have to travel further and further to find game. This puts them in conflict with neighbouring tribes who are hunting the same shrinking supply. And then there's the alcohol. The Cherokee had never encountered alcohol before the Europeans came. They had no cultural framework for it, no traditions around moderate drinking, no understanding of addiction. The traders figured this out fast. Alcohol became a tool. Show up at a negotiation with plenty of rum, get the Cherokee leaders drunk, and suddenly the terms of the deal shift in your favour. Use alcohol to create debts that can only be paid in land or slaves. Use it to destabilize communities, to create conflicts that can be exploited. Alcoholism tears through Cherokee society. Violence increases. Families fall apart. Leaders make terrible decisions while drunk and can't take them back when they sober up. The Cherokee themselves recognize the problem. Their leaders asked the colonial authorities again and again to stop the sale of alcohol to their people. Those requests were ignored. This is what survival looks like now. The Cherokee aren't living in that peaceful world of misty mountains and sacred fires anymore. They're caught between three European empires, each trying to use them against the others. The English in the Carolinas, the French in the Mississippi Valley, the Spanish in Florida. The Cherokee learn to play this game. They become skilled diplomats, making alliances and breaking them as circumstances change. They trade with whoever offers the best terms. They fight alongside whoever serves their interests at the moment. They're not victims in this story, they're players. But it's a game they didn't choose, played by rules they didn't make, and the deck is stacked against them from the start. In 1758, things fall apart with the English. Cherokee warriors had been fighting alongside the British in the French and Indian War. They were allies, supposed to be anyway. But on their way home from the fighting, a group of Cherokee warriors stopped in Virginia to rest. Their horses were tired. They were tired. They just helped the British fight their war. They figured they were among friends. They weren't. Some Virginia settlers saw the Cherokee horses and decided they wanted them. Words were exchanged, then weapons. When it was over, several Cherokee warriors were dead, murdered by the very people they'd been fighting to protect. The Cherokee sent a war party to avenge their dead. Because that's what you do. That's what the clan system demands. Blood for blood. Balance restored. The settlers screamed murder. The colonial government demanded the Cherokee hand over the warriors responsible. The Cherokee refused. Why should they hand over men for restoring balance? The settlers started it. What followed was the Anglo-Cherokee War. 3 years of brutal fighting. The British sent armies into Cherokee territory with one mission: total destruction. They didn't just fight the warriors, they burned towns, every town they could reach. They destroyed crops still standing in the fields, slaughtered livestock, burned granaries full of corn that would have fed families through the winter. The Cherokee fought back with everything they had. They knew these mountains better than any British soldier ever could. They used that knowledge, striking from ambush, melting back into the forest, appearing where they weren't expected. But guerrilla tactics can only do so much against an enemy with unlimited supplies and no rules about targeting civilians. By 1761, the Cherokee were forced to surrender. The peace treaty cost them huge amounts of land, good land, hunting grounds that had fed their people for generations, gone, signed away to make the settlers feel safe. That's the pattern now. Fight, lose, surrender territory, watch the borders of your world shrink a little more, and the American Revolution is coming. That war will split the Cherokee right down the middle. Some will side with the British, hoping that a British victory will stop the endless tide of American settlers pushing into their land. Others will try to stay neutral, to wait and see which side wins before committing. And there's a woman. Her name is Nanyehi. The English call her Nancy Ward. She was born in Chota, the sacred mother town, around 1738. The same year, a smallpox epidemic killed half her people. Her mother was from the Wolf clan, her uncle one of the most powerful chiefs in the nation. At 17, Nanyehi fought in a battle against the Creek, crouching behind a log beside her husband, chewing his rifle bullets to make them more jagged, more deadly. When he fell, she didn't run. She picked up his rifle and charged. The Cherokee won that day, and Nanyehi was named Gigao, beloved woman, the highest honor a Cherokee woman could receive. Now she's in her 40s. She's seen everything, the epidemics, the wars, the treaties that always cost more land. She's married an English trader, learned their language and customs, raised children in both worlds, and she's about to try something dangerous. She's going to try to make peace in a time when everyone wants war. But that's a story for another stretch of this night. Right now, picture yourself in a Cherokee town around 1770. The world your grandparents knew is gone. The population has recovered somewhat from the worst of the epidemics, but it's still a fraction of what it once was. The old ceremonies continue, but they feel different now. The sacred fires burn, but in fewer towns. The 7 clans still matter, but their power isn't what it used to be. European goods are everywhere. The clothes you wear are probably made of trade cloth now, not deerskin. The tools you use are metal, not stone. The gun leaning against the wall of your house is essential for hunting and defense. You might even have a few cattle, learned from watching the settlers. Some Cherokee have started farming in the European style, growing cotton and tobacco for sale, rather than corn and beans for food. The English language is creeping in. Some Cherokee have learned it for trade. A few have converted to Christianity, following the missionaries who've started to appear. The old ways and the new ways exist side by side, sometimes blending, sometimes clashing. Your grandmother might remember a time before all this. She might tell stories about the old world, before the strangers came, before the dying times. She might know songs and ceremonies that younger people have never learned. She carries a whole world inside her, a world that's slipping away a little more with each passing year. And somewhere out there, beyond the mountains, the colonists are getting restless. They're tired of British rule. They're talking about independence, about creating their own nation. When that war comes, the Cherokee will have to choose sides. And whatever they choose, they'll lose. That's the thing about this part of the story. The Cherokee have survived. They've adapted. They've learned new skills, made new alliances, found ways to exist in a world that keeps trying to destroy them, but the ground keeps shifting under their feet. Every time they think they've figured out the rules change. The diseases keep coming in waves. Smallpox again in 1738, again in 1759. Each epidemic kills thousands more. Each one disrupts the fragile recovery. Each one carries away more of the old knowledge, more of the people who remember. And the borders keep shrinking. Every war ends with another treaty. Every treaty costs more land. The 40,000 square miles your ancestors called home has been cut nearly in half, and the cutting isn't done yet. But here's the thing. Through all of this, the Cherokee don't give up. They don't disappear. They bend. They adapt. They change. They keep finding ways to survive. The 7 clans are still meeting in their council houses. The clan mothers are still passing identity through the maternal line. The hunters are still going to water at dawn, praying to the spirits, honouring the deer they kill. The women are still planting corn and beans and squash along the riverbanks. The form changes, the essence remains, and soon something new is going to happen. A generation is coming of age that will face a choice their ancestors never imagined. They'll be asked whether to hold on to the old ways or to transform completely, whether to resist the American civilization pressing in from all sides or to adopt it wholesale. A young woman from the Wolf clan is about to make a decision that will save the lives of white settlers, even as her own people prepare for war. She'll become a bridge between 2 worlds, speaking for peace when others call for blood. And a boy is about to be born somewhere in the Tennessee country, to a Cherokee mother and possibly a white father. He'll grow up with a limp that keeps him from being a warrior. He'll become a silversmith instead, working with metal, creating beautiful things, and he'll spend 12 years of his life trying to capture the sounds of his language on paper, trying to give his people something no outside force can take away. The world keeps turning, the story keeps unfolding, and the Cherokee keeps surviving, 1 generation at a time, through catastrophe after catastrophe, holding on to who they are even as everything around them changes. Nanyehi was 17 years old when she followed her husband into battle. The year was 1755. The Cherokee were at war with the Creek, a conflict that had been simmering for years over hunting grounds and old grudges. Her husband, Kingfisher, was a warrior of the Deer clan. When his war party set out for Creek territory, Nanyehi went with him. This wasn't unusual. Cherokee women often accompanied war parties, not to fight, but to cook, to carry supplies, to tend the wounded. But Nanyehi wasn't content to stay in the back. When the 2 sides met at a place called Taliwa, near present-day Canton, Georgia, she crouched behind a fallen log next to her husband, helping him reload his rifle. Here's the thing about early rifles. They took forever to load. Pour the powder, ram the ball down the barrel, prime the pan, all while people are trying to kill you. Any advantage you could get, you took. Nanyehi chewed her husband's lead bullets before he loaded them, chewed them with her teeth to make the edges jagged and uneven. A smooth ball might pass clean through a man, a chewed one tears. The battle was brutal. Hours of shooting and screaming and smoke, and then Kingfisher fell, shot dead right next to her. Most people would have run, or frozen, or collapsed with grief. Nanyehi did none of these things. She picked up her husband's rifle, still warm from his hands. She stood up from behind that log and she charged. The Cherokee warriors, seeing this woman running toward the enemy, screaming, firing, followed her. They surged forward. The creek line broke. The battle was won. When it was over, the clan mothers met. They talked about what Nanyehi had done, how she'd turned the tide of the fight, how she'd shown courage that put most warriors to shame, and they gave her a title that only a handful of women in Cherokee history had ever received. Gigao, beloved woman. This wasn't just an honor, it was power, real power. As beloved woman, Nanyehi now had a vote in the General Council. She led the Women's Council. She had absolute authority over the fate of prisoners taken in war. She could condemn them to death or grant them life with a single word. The Cherokee believed that the Great Spirit sometimes spoke through the beloved woman. When she talked, people listened. She was 17 years old. Over the next 2 decades, Nanyehi became one of the most important figures in Cherokee politics. She remarried, this time to an English trader named Bryant Ward. She learned English. She learned European customs. She raised children who moved easily between both worlds. She changed her name to Nancy Ward because that's what the English could pronounce. But she never stopped being Cherokee. She never forgot where her power came from or what her responsibilities were. By 1776, Nancy Ward was in her late 30s. The American Revolution had just begun, and the Cherokee were being asked to choose sides. The British made their pitch first. They sent agents into Cherokee territory with presents and promises. "Help us defeat the American rebels," they said, "and we'll protect your lands. We'll enforce the boundary lines. We'll keep the settlers from pushing any further into your territory." It wasn't a bad argument. The settlers were the ones constantly encroaching on Cherokee land. The settlers were the ones ignoring treaties, moving on to Cherokee hunting grounds, starting fights. Maybe a British victory would stop them. But Nancy Ward wasn't convinced. She'd seen too many wars. She knew what happened when the Cherokee fought the colonists. They might win battles. They'd always lose the war, and every war ended with less land, fewer people, more suffering. Her cousin felt differently. His name was Siu Gansini, Dragging Canoe, and he was done with peace. Dragging Canoe was a warrior through and through, tall, fierce, scarred from a dozen battles. He'd grown up watching the Cherokee lose everything piece by piece, and something inside him had hardened into iron. At a council meeting in 1776, the debate over what to do about the American Revolution reached a breaking point. The older chief spoke of caution, of waiting to see which side would win, of protecting what little land remained. Dragging Canoe stood up. The firelight flickered across his face as he addressed the council. "Where are the Delawares now?" he asked. "Where are the Pequots? Where are the Narragansetts, the Mohicans, the Pocanets, and all the other powerful tribes of our people?" He paused. The council house was silent. "They have vanished before the greed of the white man, as snow before a summer sun. Will we allow ourselves to share their fate?" The older chief shifted uncomfortably. Nancy Ward spoke for caution, but Dragging Canoe had the young warriors on their side. Men who were tired of watching their world shrink. Men who wanted to do something. Anything. "We are not yet conquered," Dragging Canoe said. "We have not yet lost everything. But if we do not fight now, we will lose it all. The settlers are locusts. They will not stop. They'll eat everything until nothing is left." An older chief warned him that the path of war would bring only destruction, that the colonists were too many, too well armed, too determined. Dragging Canoe's response became famous. He pointed toward the lands the Cherokee had already ceded. "We had a country," he said, "a country where the bones of our ancestors lie buried. I have no land to lose. I will fight until I have no more blood to spill." The council couldn't reach agreement, but Dragging Canoe didn't need their permission. He announced that he would attack the settlements along the Watauga River. He asked Nancy Ward to prepare the black drink, a sacred tea that warriors consumed before battle. It was her duty as beloved woman to perform this ritual. Nancy Ward prepared the drink, but she also did something else. She had 3 white traders staying in her town, men she knew, men she'd traded with for years. She released them. She told them about Dragging Canoe's plans. She told them to warn the settlers. "Go," she said. "Tell them what's coming. Tell them to get their women and children to safety." The traders rode hard. They reached the Watauga settlements with just enough time. The settlers evacuated their families to a fort. When Dragging Canoe's warriors attacked, they found prepared defences instead of sleeping victims. The attack failed. Dragging Canoe himself was badly wounded. And when the settlers figured out who had warned them, Nancy Ward became a hero to the colonists and a traitor to some of her own people. But she wasn't done. After the failed raid, the Cherokee captured a white woman named Lydia Bean. She was the wife of a settler, taken during the fighting. The warriors who captured her decided she should be burned at the stake. They tied her to a pole, they piled wood around her feet, they lit the fire, and then Nancy Ward arrived. As beloved woman, she had absolute power over prisoners. She walked through the crowd of warriors, right up to that burning pyre, and she ordered them to stop. She ordered Lydia Bean cut down. Nobody argued, nobody could argue. The beloved woman had spoken. Nancy Ward took Lydia Bean into her own home. She nursed her back to health. And during those weeks of recovery, the two women taught each other things. Lydia Bean showed Nancy Ward how to make butter and cheese, how to care for dairy cattle, skills the Cherokee had never learned. Nancy Ward would later introduce dairy farming to her people. In return, Nancy Ward taught Lydia Bean about Cherokee ways, about the clans and the ceremonies, about what it meant to be part of a nation that had existed in these mountains for thousands of years. When Lydia Bean was well enough to travel, Nancy Ward sent her home, back to her family, back to the settlements that were even now preparing to retaliate against the Cherokee. The retaliation came that fall. Colonial militias from Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina invaded Cherokee territory. They burned over 50 towns. They destroyed crops and livestock. They killed anyone who resisted and some who didn't. But when they reached Chota, the sacred mother town where Nancy Ward lived, they stopped. They didn't burn it. Some say it was out of gratitude for what she'd done. Others say they knew better than to destroy the town of the beloved woman. Either way, Chota survived. Nancy Ward kept trying. Year after year, she spoke for peace. She attended treaty negotiations. Shocking. American officials who had never seen a woman participate in diplomacy. At one meeting, when John Sevier expressed surprise that a woman was speaking, Nancy Ward told him plainly, "You know that women are always looked upon as nothing, but we are your mothers. You are our sons. Our cry is all for peace. Let it continue." The American negotiators didn't know what to make of her. In their world, women stayed home. They didn't speak at councils. They certainly didn't have the power to decide life and death. But they respected her. Thomas Jefferson himself wrote that her wishes should be followed. Meanwhile, Dragging Canoe refused to give up. When the main body of Cherokee made peace, he led his followers south to the Chickamauga Creek area. They became known as the Chickamauga Cherokee, and they fought a guerrilla war against American expansion for another 20 years. Dragging Canoe died in 1792, still fighting. His last words, according to legend, were a warning. "The whole nation is sitting in darkness. I can do nothing more. You must carry on." Nancy Ward lived until 1822. She watched the Cherokee world she'd known transformed beyond recognition. She watched her people adopt European farming, European clothes, European religion. She watched them write a constitution and publish a newspaper and do everything the Americans asked of them, and she watched it not be enough. In 1817, at nearly 80 years old, Nancy Ward sent a message to the Cherokee National Council. She was too weak to attend in person, so her son read her words aloud. "Our beloved children and head men of the Cherokee Nation, we address you warriors in council. We have raised all of you on the land which we now have. We know that our country has once been extensive, but by repeated sales has become circumscribed to a small tract. Your mothers, your sisters ask and beg of you not to part with any more of our land." Her words were signed by 12 other women, including her daughter and granddaughter, a plea from the women who had always been the backbone of Cherokee society. The council listened politely, and then they sold more land anyway. The world had changed. Cherokee society had become more patriarchal, more like the Americans they were trying to appease. The beloved woman didn't have the power she once had. The Women's Council didn't have the authority it once held. Nancy Ward died in 1822, running an inn on the Ocoee River, taking care of orphans, watching the final collapse approach. But here's the thing. While Nancy Ward was fighting for peace, while Dragging Canoe was fighting his endless war, while the Cherokee were losing battle after battle and treaty after treaty, something else was happening. A boy was growing up in the Tennessee country. His name was Sequoyah. His mother was from the Paint clan. His father might have been a white trader named Nathaniel Gist, or might have been someone else entirely. Nobody's quite sure. What everyone remembers is that Sequoyah had a limp, some kind of injury or illness in childhood that left one leg shorter than the other. He couldn't run fast enough to be a messenger. He couldn't fight well enough to be a warrior. So he found other things to do. He learned to work with silver. He became a silversmith, making jewellery and decorations that he sold to Cherokee and white traders alike. He was good at it. He made enough money to support himself. But Sequoyah was watching, always watching. He noticed how the white traders could make marks on paper and send them to people far away. He noticed how those marks could carry messages, could record information, could preserve knowledge in a way that didn't depend on memory. The Cherokee called it talking leaves, and Sequoyah became obsessed with it. In 1809, he started working on something, a way for Cherokee to talk on paper too, a way to capture their language in marks that anyone could read. His neighbours thought he'd lost his mind. His wife thought he was practicing witchcraft. But Sequoyah kept working, year after year after year. 12 years he worked on it. 12 years of failure and frustration and starting over. 12 years of people laughing at him, burning his work, calling him crazy. And then, in 1821, he finished. But that's its own story. A story about a man who gave his people something that couldn't be taken away. A story about what happens when you refuse to give up, even when everyone thinks you're insane. Right now, as you're lying there in your comfortable bed, think about what the Cherokee had been through by this point. 2.5 centuries of contact, diseases that killed 90% of the population, wars with the Spanish, the English, the Americans, land lost in treaty after treaty after treaty, and they were still here, still fighting, still adapting, still Cherokee. Nancy Ward had tried peace. Dragging Canoe had tried war. Neither had stopped the tide. But maybe there was another way. Maybe if the Cherokee could prove they were just as civilized as the Americans, if they could read and write and govern themselves and build farms and businesses, maybe then the Americans would leave them alone. That was the theory anyway. It would be tested in the years to come, tested to destruction. Picture a man sitting alone in a cabin, scratching marks on pieces of bark. It's 1809. The man's name is Sequoyah. He's around 40 years old, though nobody knows for sure exactly when he was born. He has a wife, children, a small farm that needs tending, a silversmith business that pays the bills, and he's ignoring all of it. For months now, Sequoia has been obsessed with something. He can't explain it properly to anyone, can't make them understand why it matters so much. But he's seen the white traders do something that seems like magic. They make marks on paper. They give that paper to someone else, and somehow that person knows what the first person wanted to say, even if they're 100 miles apart. Talking leaves, the Cherokee call it, magic. But Sequoia doesn't think it's magic. He thinks it's a skill, a trick, something that can be learned. And if the white people can do it, why can't the Cherokee? His neighbors think he's lost his mind. You have to understand who Sequoia was before this obsession took hold. He was born sometime in the 1770s in a small village in the Tennessee country. His mother was Woot-Tay, a woman of the Paint clan. His father might have been a white trader named Nathaniel Gist, or might have been a Cherokee man. The historical record is unclear, and Sequoia himself never said much about it. What everyone agreed on was that Sequoia walked with a limp. Some childhood illness or injury had left one of his legs shorter than the other. He couldn't run fast enough to be a messenger for the Deer clan. He couldn't fight well enough to be a warrior for the Wolf clan. In a society where men proved their worth through speed and strength and bravery in battle, Sequoia was at a disadvantage from the start. So he found other ways to matter. He learned to work with silver. It turned out he had gifted hands, even if his legs didn't work right. He could take raw metal and shape it into beautiful things: jewelry, decorations, trade goods. He built a reputation as a skilled craftsman, someone whose work was worth paying for. He also learned to work with metal tools, becoming a blacksmith as well as a silversmith. He made his own tools. He solved problems through ingenuity rather than strength. He developed a habit of looking at things and figuring out how they worked. That habit would change history. Sequoia never learned to read or write English. He never learned any written language. He was, by European standards, illiterate. But that didn't mean he was stupid. It meant he came at the problem of writing from a completely fresh perspective. The white traders had books. Sequoia couldn't read them, but he studied them anyway. He looked at the marks on the pages. He noticed that the same marks appeared over and over in different combinations. He watched the traders make new marks with quills and ink, watched them fold the paper and send it away, watched other traders read those marks and know what they said. It had to be a system, some kind of code, a way of turning spoken sounds into visible marks. If he could figure out how it worked, he could create a system for Cherokee. In 1809, he started trying. His first approach was logical enough. He would create a different symbol for every word in the Cherokee language. Each word would have its own picture, its own mark. Simple, right? Except the Cherokee language has thousands of words, tens of thousands when you count all the variations. After months of work, Sequoia had hundreds of symbols, and he was nowhere close to covering the whole language. Worse, nobody could memorize that many different marks, including him. He scrapped everything and started over. Maybe he should try what the English did. They had 26 letters, and they combined them to spell every word. Maybe Cherokee could work the same way, but Cherokee isn't English. The sounds are different. The structure is different. Cherokee is a polysynthetic language, meaning single words can contain as much information as entire English sentences. Trying to force it into an alphabet designed for English was like trying to pour water into a basket. It just didn't hold. More months of work, more failure, more starting over. His wife, Sally Waters, watched her husband disappear into his obsession. The farm went untended. The silversmith work piled up. Sequoia spent every spare moment scratching marks on pieces of bark, muttering to himself, trying combinations that never quite worked. She thought he'd gone crazy. Honestly, sometimes he wondered the same thing. The neighbours talked. Of course they talked. That lame man, the silversmith, have you seen what he's doing? Sitting there making marks all day. Thinks he can make the Cherokee language into talking leaves. Who does he think he is? Some of them thought it was worse than crazy. Some of them thought it was witchcraft. Making marks that could carry thoughts? That sounded like dark medicine. Bad spirits. The kind of thing that brought trouble to everyone around it. One night Sally had had enough. She'd watched her husband disappear into madness for years now. The children needed things. The farm was failing. Other men provided for their families. Her husband sat in a corner making scratches on bark like a child playing pretend games. She gathered up all of Sequoia's work. Years of work. Thousands of symbols scratched on bark and paper and leather and anything else he could find. Stacks of it. Piles of it. The accumulated effort of years of obsession. She took it all outside, and she burned it. The neighbours probably saw the flames, probably nodded to themselves. Good. Maybe now that crazy man would come to his senses. Maybe now he'd be a proper husband and father again. When Sequoia came home and saw what had happened, he just stood there, watching the ashes cool in the evening air, watching years of his life drift away as smoke and cinder. The symbols he'd spent so long developing, the progress he'd made, the failed experiments and the promising ones, all of it gone. His wife stood nearby, arms crossed, waiting for him to rage or weep, or finally admit that she'd been right all along, that this talking leaves nonsense was exactly that. Nonsense. Sequoia said nothing. He stood there until the fire died completely, until nothing was left but grey ash and a few charred fragments. Then he went back inside and started over. Not from scratch exactly. He'd learned things from his failures. The knowledge was in his head now, burned into his memory. He knew that a symbol for every word was impossible. He knew that an alphabet wouldn't work for Cherokee. There had to be another way. He started listening differently, really listening to the sounds of his language. Not the words, but the sounds that made up the words. And he realized something. Cherokee doesn't have that many distinct sounds, not compared to the number of words. The same sounds appear over and over, combined in different ways. They're not individual letters like in English. They're syllables, chunks of sound. What if he made a symbol for each syllable instead of each word? He started counting, cataloguing every distinct syllable in the Cherokee language. It took months, but when he was done, he had a number he could work with. 85 sounds, maybe 86. That was it. The entire Cherokee language was built from fewer than 100 syllables, 85 symbols. That was manageable. A person could memorize 85 symbols. A child could learn them. Now he needed to design the symbols themselves. A missionary had given him an English spelling book years earlier. Sequoia couldn't read it, but he liked the shapes of the letters. He started borrowing them. The letter D became a symbol for a Cherokee sound. The letter R became something else entirely. He wasn't copying the English alphabet. He was stealing the shapes and using them for his own purposes. He invented some symbols from scratch. He modified others. He created a system where each symbol represented one syllable of the Cherokee language. You could write any Cherokee word by stringing together the symbols for its syllables. You could read any word by sounding out the syllables in order. It was elegant. It was logical. It was something no human being had ever done before. Other writing systems had been created throughout history, but they developed slowly over centuries, passed down and modified by generations of scribes. What Sequoyah did was invent a complete writing system by himself, from nothing, with no formal education, in about 12 years. By 1821, he was ready. The problem was nobody believed him. The Cherokee leaders had heard about Sequoyah's project. They'd heard the rumors about witchcraft too. When he came to them claiming he could teach any Cherokee to read and write in a matter of weeks, they were skeptical, to put it mildly. One chief reportedly laughed out loud. 12 years of work, and you expect us to believe you've accomplished what no Cherokee has ever done? You can't even read English. How could you possibly invent writing? But Sequoyah had prepared for this. He had a secret weapon. Her name was Ayoka, his daughter. She was about 6 years old, and she could read. Sequoyah had been teaching her the syllabary for months. She'd picked it up quickly, the way children do. She could look at any combination of symbols and speak the Cherokee words they represented. She could hear any Cherokee word and write it down in symbols. To her, it was as natural as speaking. At a council meeting in New Echota, Sequoyah proposed a test. He would leave the room. The chiefs could say anything they wanted, and Ayoka would write it down. Then Sequoyah would come back, look at what she'd written, and tell them exactly what they'd said. The chiefs looked at each other. Some were amused, some were suspicious, but they agreed. This should be interesting at least, and if the old silversmith was running a trick, they'd figure it out soon enough. Sequoyah walked out of the council house. The door closed behind him. Inside, the chiefs huddled together, whispering. They had to choose something he couldn't possibly guess. Something that would prove this wasn't just memorization or trickery. They settled on a message. One of the chiefs spoke it aloud. Little Ayoka listened carefully, her face serious and focused. Then she picked up a piece of paper and began scratching symbols with a steady hand. When she finished, they called Sequoyah back in. He walked to where his daughter sat, picked up the paper. The room was silent, every chief watching. Years of work, thousands of symbols burned, a reputation as a madman, all of it came down to this moment. Sequoyah looked at the marks his daughter had made, and he read their words back to them, perfectly. The silence stretched. Then one of the chiefs spoke up. Again. Try again. They tried again. Longer messages, more complex ideas, secret things that only the people in that room would know. Names of places Sequoyah had never been. Details about events he hadn't witnessed. Every time, little Ayoka wrote it down. Every time, her father read it back exactly right. By the 4th or 5th test, the skepticism had turned to something else. Wonder, maybe. Or fear. This was real. This actually worked. It wasn't magic. It wasn't witchcraft. It was a system, a tool, something any Cherokee could learn. The council voted to adopt the syllabary officially. They would teach it to everyone. They would make the Cherokee a literate people. What happened next was unlike anything that had ever happened in human history. Within months, Cherokee people across the nation were learning to read and write. Not in English, which took years of study in missionary schools. In Cherokee, which took days, sometimes hours. The syllabary was so intuitive, so perfectly matched to the sounds of the language that anyone who spoke Cherokee could learn it almost immediately. The speed of it astonished everyone. White missionaries who had spent decades trying to teach Cherokee people to read English watched in disbelief as those same people became literate in their own language within weeks. One missionary wrote that the Cherokee were learning to read and write faster than he could keep track of them. Parents taught children around evening fires. Children taught grandparents who had thought themselves too old to learn new things. Hunters scratched messages on trees for each other, leaving notes about game and trails and meeting places. Young men sent love letters to young women in distant towns. Merchants kept records of trades and debts. Healers wrote down medicine formulas that had only existed in memory before. The syllabary spread through the Cherokee Nation like a fire through dry grass. It jumped from town to town, family to family. People who had never held a pen in their lives were suddenly writing letters to relatives, recording their thoughts, leaving messages for the future. Within 5 years, the Cherokee had a higher literacy rate than the white settlers surrounding them. Think about that for a moment. Let it sink in. A people who had never had writing, who had relied on memory and oral tradition for thousands of years, became one of the most literate populations in North America almost overnight. Not in the language of their colonizers, but in their own language. The language of their ancestors, the language of the sacred ceremonies and the clan mothers and the old stories. They could now write down their laws, their history, their stories, their songs. They could communicate across vast distances without relying on messengers who might forget or change the words. They could preserve knowledge for future generations in a way that memory alone could never guarantee. Sequoyah had given them something that couldn't be taken away, something that belonged to them. He became famous. Not just among the Cherokee, but among white Americans too. They couldn't quite believe what he'd done. A man who couldn't read any language had invented a writing system? It seemed impossible. The Cherokee government gave him a silver medal and a lifetime pension. His face would later appear on stamps and statues. Schools would be named after him. The giant redwood trees of California would be named after him, though he never saw them. But Sequoyah wasn't done. He spent his later years trying to find Cherokee people who had migrated west generations earlier, hoping to share the syllabary with them too. He wanted every Cherokee everywhere to have this gift. He died somewhere in Mexico in 1843, still searching. The syllabary he created is still used today. Cherokee children still learn it in schools. Cherokee signs still appear in Oklahoma and North Carolina. The talking leaves that Sequoyah spent 12 years creating are still talking nearly 200 years later. And here's the thing that makes it hurt. Sequoyah gave his people a weapon, a tool for survival, a way to prove they were just as civilized, just as capable, just as human as anyone else. The Cherokee used that tool to build a republic, to write a constitution, to publish a newspaper, to do everything the Americans said they needed to do to be treated as equals, and it still wasn't enough. But that's the next part of the story. For now, lying there in your warm bed, just think about that man in his cabin, scratching marks on bark, watching his wife burn everything he'd worked for, starting over anyway. 12 years of failure and ridicule and doubt, and then, finally, success. Sometimes the impossible just takes a little longer. On February 21st, 1828, something happened that had never happened before in the history of North America. A newspaper rolled off the press. Nothing unusual about that. Newspapers had been around for over a century. But this newspaper was different. Half of it was printed in English. The other half was printed in Cherokee, the Cherokee Phoenix, the first Native American newspaper ever published, the first bilingual newspaper in the United States. The masthead carried a motto in both languages. In English, "I will arise." In Cherokee, the same words in Sequoia's syllabary, a declaration and a promise. We are here, we are rising, we will not disappear. The editor was a young man named Elias Boudinot. He'd been born Buck Watie, a full-blooded Cherokee from an influential family. As a teenager, he'd been sent to a missionary school in Connecticut, where he'd converted to Christianity and taken the name of his wealthy benefactor. He was educated, articulate, and passionate about using the tools of American civilization to protect his people. Boudinot understood something crucial. The Cherokee weren't just fighting for land anymore. They were fighting for perception, for legitimacy, for the right to exist as a nation. The Americans kept saying the same thing. Indians are savages. They can't govern themselves. They don't have written languages or laws or proper governments. They're obstacles to progress. The only solution is to move them out of the way. Boudinot and other Cherokee leaders decided to prove them wrong. The Cherokee Phoenix became their weapon. Every week it published news about tribal affairs, reprinted articles from American newspapers, reported on international events, and most importantly, documented everything the Cherokee were doing to demonstrate their civilization. "Look," the newspaper said, "we have a written language, we have schools, we have farms and businesses, we have Christian churches, we have a constitutional government. We're not what you say we are." The paper was read far beyond Cherokee territory. Sympathetic whites in the North subscribed. Government officials in Washington received copies. For the first time, the Cherokee had a voice that could reach the entire nation. But a newspaper needs a nation to write about. And by 1827, the Cherokee had built one. The man most responsible for that nation was John Ross. Ross was an unlikely leader for the Cherokee people. His father was a Scottish trader. His mother was part Cherokee, part Scottish herself. By blood, John Ross was only 1/8 Cherokee. He looked white. He dressed like a white man. He spoke English as his first language and had to learn Cherokee as a second. But blood quantum wasn't how the Cherokee measured belonging. Your clan determined your identity, and clan came through your mother. John Ross's mother was of the Bird clan. That made John Ross Cherokee. Period. He'd grown up straddling two worlds. His father made sure he got an English education. He learned to read and write, to do business, to navigate the world of treaties and trade. But he also learned the old ways, the ceremonies, the responsibilities, what it meant to be part of a people. During the War of 1812, Ross served as a lieutenant under Andrew Jackson, fighting against the Creek at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. He was a good soldier. Jackson respected him. They shook hands after the victory. Ross would remember that handshake later, when Jackson became the greatest enemy his people had ever faced. By the 1820s, Ross had become the most powerful political figure in the Cherokee Nation. He was smart. He was patient. He understood American law and American politics better than most Americans did. And he was absolutely committed to one idea. The Cherokee would survive by becoming undeniably civilized. In July of 1827, delegates from across the Cherokee Nation gathered at New Echota for a constitutional convention. Think about what that means. A people who had governed themselves through clan councils and town meetings for thousands of years were about to adopt a written constitution. They were about to create a formal government modelled on the United States itself. The debates went on for weeks. Some traditionalists opposed the whole idea. This wasn't the Cherokee way, they argued. The old system had worked for generations. Why change now? But the majority understood the stakes. The Americans would never respect a government they didn't recognize. If the Cherokee wanted to be treated as a nation, they had to look like a nation, at least by American standards. The Constitution they produced was remarkable. It established 3 branches of government, just like the United States. An executive branch headed by a principal chief and an assistant principal chief, elected by popular vote. A legislative branch with 2 houses, the National Committee and the National Council. A judicial branch with a Supreme Court and lower courts in each district. It included a Bill of Rights, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the right to a fair trial, protection against unreasonable searches. Things the Cherokee had always practiced, now written down in language the Americans would understand. The Constitution declared the Cherokee Nation a sovereign entity. Its lands belonged to the Cherokee people collectively. No individual could sell land to outsiders. No state had authority within Cherokee borders. John Ross was elected principal chief under the new Constitution. He would hold that position for nearly 40 years, through everything that was about to come. Ross had built a good life in the Cherokee Nation. He had a plantation, a ferry business, a beautiful home called Rose Cottage. He had a wife named Quati, a full-blooded Cherokee woman he'd married when they were both young. They had 5 children together. By any measure, Ross was a successful man living a comfortable life. He could have walked away. With his fair skin and English education, he could have passed into white society, taken his wealth, and left the Cherokee to their fate. Some people of mixed ancestry did exactly that. Ross never considered it. Not for a moment. The Cherokee had done it. They'd built a republic. They had a written language, a newspaper, a constitution, elected leaders, schools, churches, farms. They'd adopted Christianity, American-style clothing, American-style government. Some wealthy Cherokee even owned enslaved black people, because that's what wealthy Americans did in the South. They had become, by any reasonable measure, a civilized nation. And it didn't matter at all. Because in the summer of 1828, a white man named Benjamin Parks was walking through Cherokee territory near a place called Dahlonega. He kicked at a rock, picked it up, looked at it more closely. Gold. Word spread fast. Within months, thousands of prospectors were flooding onto Cherokee land. They came from Georgia, from the Carolinas, from everywhere. They set up camps. They dug mines. They panned the streams. They took whatever they wanted and dared anyone to stop them. This was the Georgia Gold Rush, the first major gold rush in American history. 20 years before California, 20 years before the 49ers, there was Dahlonega. The Cherokee tried to enforce their laws. This was their land. These miners were trespassing. But how do you stop thousands of men crazed with gold fever? How do you enforce laws when the people breaking them don't recognize your authority to make laws in the first place? Georgia made its move. The state legislature passed a series of laws designed to destroy the Cherokee Nation from within. The laws declared that Cherokee government was null and void. Cherokee laws had no force. Cherokee courts had no authority. All Cherokee people were now subject to Georgia state law. But that wasn't all. The laws made it illegal for Cherokee people to testify in court against white people. So if a white man robbed you, assaulted you, murdered your family, you couldn't testify about what happened. Your voice didn't count. The laws made it illegal for the Cherokee to mine gold on their own land. The gold was Georgia's now. The laws made it illegal for the Cherokee to hold council meetings. The government they'd just created, illegal. The laws made it a crime for anyone, white or Cherokee, to encourage the Cherokee to resist removal. Speaking out against what was happening could land you in prison. To enforce these laws, Georgia created the Georgia Guard, a state militia. Their job was to harass, intimidate, and terrorize the Cherokee into leaving. The Georgia Guard rode through Cherokee territory like an occupying army. They broke into homes in the middle of the night, dragging families out of bed. They confiscated property, claiming it belonged to the state now. They arrested Cherokee leaders on trumped-up charges and held them for weeks without trial. They beat people who talked back. They destroyed crops. They drove off livestock. They did whatever they wanted because who was going to stop them? The Cherokee couldn't testify against them in court. The federal government wouldn't intervene. They had complete impunity. One Guard member reportedly bragged that he could kill a Cherokee man and face no consequences. He was probably right. Cherokee families started sleeping in the woods, afraid to stay in their own homes. Children went hungry because their fathers had been arrested for the crime of being Cherokee on Cherokee land. Women were left to defend homesteads alone against men with guns and badges and the full backing of the state of Georgia. This wasn't law enforcement. This was ethnic cleansing with paperwork. The Cherokee Phoenix documented all of it. Every outrage, every violation, every broken promise. Elias Boudinot wrote editorial after editorial, appealing to the conscience of the American people. Surely, he argued, when Americans saw what was being done in their name, they would put a stop to it. The paper printed letters from Cherokee citizens describing what they'd endured. It reprinted articles from northern newspapers that condemned Georgia's actions. It published the text of every treaty the United States had ever signed with the Cherokee, showing how each one was being violated. For a while, it seemed to be working. Subscription requests poured in from across the country. Religious groups in the North raised money for the Cherokee cause. Politicians cited the Phoenix in congressional debates. Public opinion, at least in some parts of the country, was turning. But Georgia wasn't interested in public opinion. He was wrong about America's conscience, because in 1829, Andrew Jackson became President of the United States. Jackson had been a hero of the frontier wars. He'd fought alongside Cherokee warriors, including John Ross, against the Creek. He'd been present at the birth of the Cherokee Republic, but Jackson had never seen native peoples as equals. He saw them as obstacles, children who didn't know what was best for them. The kindest thing to do, Jackson believed, was to move them west of the Mississippi, away from white civilization, where they could live in peace until they eventually faded away. In 1830, with Jackson's full support, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. The law authorized the president to negotiate treaties with Native American tribes, exchanging their lands in the east for territory west of the Mississippi. The word negotiate made it sound voluntary, like a business deal between equals. It wasn't. The debate in Congress was fierce. Senators and representatives from the North argued passionately against the bill. This was unjust, they said. It violated treaties the United States had signed. It was a stain on the nation's honor. Congressman Davy Crockett of Tennessee, the famous frontiersman, voted against removal. He knew it would end his political career. He voted no anyway. The bill passed the House by just 5 votes, one of the closest votes in congressional history. John Ross refused to accept it. He gathered petitions. Nearly 16,000 Cherokee signed documents opposing removal. That was almost the entire Cherokee population. Ross took those petitions to Washington. He met with anyone who would listen. He made the case that the Cherokee were a sovereign nation, that their treaties with the United States were the supreme law of the land, that what Georgia was doing was illegal, and he decided to fight in the one arena where the Cherokee might still win: the courts. Ross hired the best lawyers he could find. William Wirt, former Attorney General of the United States, men who knew constitutional law, who understood how to argue before the Supreme Court. In 1831, the case Cherokee Nation versus Georgia reached the highest court in the land. The Cherokee asked the court to stop Georgia's persecution. They argued that they were a foreign nation, that Georgia had no authority over them, that the treaties must be honoured. Chief Justice John Marshall delivered the opinion. It was complicated, frustrating. The court ruled that the Cherokee were not a foreign nation in the constitutional sense. They were a domestic dependent nation, like a ward to its guardian. What did that mean? It meant the court couldn't rule on the case the way it had been presented. Technical legal reasons, jurisdiction issues. But Marshall hinted at something. He seemed sympathetic. He suggested that if the right case came along, framed the right way, the court might rule in the Cherokee's favour. Ross and his lawyers went looking for that case. They found it in a white missionary named Samuel Worcester. Worcester was a Christian minister who lived in Cherokee territory, running a mission and a school. Georgia ordered all white people living in Cherokee lands to sign a loyalty oath to the state and get a permit. Worcester refused. He believed Georgia had no authority to make such demands. Georgia arrested him, tried him, sentenced him to 4 years of hard labour. Perfect, Ross thought. Now the case wasn't about whether the Cherokee could sue in federal court. It was about whether Georgia could imprison an American citizen for living on Cherokee land. That was a question the Supreme Court had to answer. In 1832, Worcester versus Georgia came before Chief Justice Marshall. Marshall's opinion was everything the Cherokee had hoped for. Georgia's laws were unconstitutional. The Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community. The laws of Georgia had no force within its boundaries. Worcester must be freed. The Cherokee had won. For one brief shining moment, it seemed like justice might prevail. And then Andrew Jackson made his position clear. The president reportedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Whether he actually spoke those exact words is debated by historians, but his actions made his meaning clear. The federal government would not enforce the Supreme Court's ruling. Georgia could do whatever it wanted. The Cherokee had won in court and lost in reality. The Georgia Guard kept riding. The gold miners kept digging. The pressure kept building. And the Cherokee Phoenix kept publishing week after week, documenting the slow-motion destruction of a nation that had done everything right. Everything the Americans had asked for. Everything they said would prove the Cherokee deserved to be treated as equals. All of it meant nothing. Because in the end, it was never about civilization. It was never about whether the Cherokee could govern themselves or write their own language or worship the right God. It was about land. It was about gold. It was about power. And the Cherokee had something that powerful men wanted. That's the thing about this part of the story. The Cherokee didn't fail. They didn't lose because they weren't smart enough or civilized enough or Christian enough. They lost because the people who wanted their land didn't care about any of that. The Cherokee Renaissance wasn't a failure. It was proof. Proof that given the chance, any people can build a nation. Proof that intelligence and capability aren't limited by race or culture. Proof that the arguments used to justify removal were always lies. The Cherokee proved everything they set out to prove, and it still wasn't enough. Because some forces can't be stopped with logic or law or appeals to conscience. Some forces only understand one language. The storm was coming, and nothing the Cherokee had built would be able to stop it. The Cherokee Nation was tearing itself apart. After the Supreme Court victory that changed nothing, after Jackson's refusal to enforce the law, after years of Georgia Guard raids and gold miners and broken promises, some Cherokee started to wonder if John Ross was leading them off a cliff. One of those people was Major Ridge. Major Ridge was everything John Ross wasn't. A full-blooded Cherokee warrior who had earned his name through blood. He'd killed his first enemy at 17. He'd fought in more battles than he could count. During the Creek War, he'd served as a major under Andrew Jackson, same as Ross, but he'd done it with a war club in his hand, not a pen. Ridge was old now, in his 60s. He'd spent his whole life fighting for the Cherokee people. He'd been one of the architects of the Cherokee Renaissance, supporting the Constitution, the schools, the farms, everything, he believed, in what they'd built. But he also knew how to read a battlefield, and everything he saw told him this was a war they couldn't win. The gold miners weren't leaving, the Georgia Guard wasn't stopping, the federal government wasn't helping. Every day that passed, more Cherokee families lost their homes, their livestock, their dignity. Every day, the situation got worse. Ridge started having conversations, quiet ones, with his son John Ridge, who'd been educated at a missionary school in Connecticut, with his nephew Elias Boudinot, the editor of the Cherokee Phoenix, with other influential Cherokee who were starting to share his doubts. John Ridge was his father's opposite in many ways. Where Major Ridge was a warrior, John was a diplomat. He'd gone north for his education, learned to dress and speak like an American gentleman, even married a white woman from Connecticut named Sarah Bird Northrup. Their marriage had caused a scandal, nearly started a riot, but John had persisted. He believed in building bridges between cultures. Now he was starting to believe those bridges led nowhere. What if Ross was wrong? What if fighting was just prolonging the inevitable? What if the best thing for the Cherokee people was to negotiate the best deal they could and move west while they still had something to bargain with? It was treason. By Cherokee law, selling tribal land without the consent of the nation was punishable by death. Ridge himself had helped write that law. He'd enforced it. Years earlier, he'd participated in the execution of a Cherokee man named Doublehead, who had secretly sold land to the Americans. Ridge knew exactly what happened to those who broke this law. He knew what he was risking. He did it anyway. But he believed he was trying to save his people. John Ridge made the argument most clearly. "Look at what's happening," he said. "Every year we stay here, we lose more. More land, more lives, more of who we are. The Americans will never let us keep this territory. They've made that clear. The only question is whether we leave on our terms or theirs. If we negotiate now," Ridge argued, "we can get money. We can get good land in the West. We can move as a nation, together, with our government and our institutions intact. If we wait until they force us out, we'll get nothing. We'll be scattered. We'll be destroyed." Elias Boudinot was torn. He'd spent years using the Cherokee Phoenix to fight for his people's right to stay. But the Phoenix had been shut down by the Georgia Guard in 1834. They'd confiscated the printing press. Boudinot had watched his life's work carted away, and he'd started to wonder if all that fighting had accomplished anything at all. Ross refused to even consider removal. As long as he was principal chief, he would never sign a treaty giving up Cherokee land. Never. The Cherokee had been in these mountains for thousands of years. They had won in the Supreme Court. The law was on their side. To give up now would be to admit that law and justice meant nothing. The two factions hardened against each other. Ross and his supporters, the vast majority of the Cherokee people, became known as the National Party. Ridge, his son, Boudinot, and their supporters became known as the Treaty Party. Old friends stopped speaking to each other. Families split. The council meetings that had once united the Cherokee now became battlegrounds of accusation and recrimination. Boudinot resigned from the Cherokee Phoenix before it was seized, unable to continue advocating for a position he no longer believed in. Ross appointed a new editor who would toe the party line. The two men who had once worked side by side to build a nation were now on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. The American government watched all this with interest. They'd been trying to get a removal treaty for years. Ross wouldn't negotiate, but maybe these other Cherokee would. In 1835, federal commissioners arrived in Cherokee territory. They weren't there to meet with John Ross. They were there to meet with Major Ridge. The negotiations happened in secret. Ridge knew that if Ross found out, he'd do everything in his power to stop them. So they met quietly, away from the capital, away from the council, a handful of Cherokee leaders deciding the fate of an entire nation. On December 29th, 1835, in the town of Nuakota, a treaty was signed. The Treaty of Nuakota gave up all Cherokee land east of the Mississippi River. All of it. The mountains where their ancestors were buried, the sacred town of Chota, the fields their mothers had farmed. Everything. In exchange, the Cherokee would receive $5 million and new land in Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. They would have 2 years to prepare for the move. After that, they would be removed by force. The treaty was signed by Major Ridge, John Ridge, Elias Boudinot, and about 100 other Cherokee. Out of a nation of 16,000 people, fewer than 500 signatures, and most of those were family members and close associates of the Ridges. Major Ridge knew exactly what he was doing. As he signed his name, he reportedly said, "I have signed my death warrant." He wasn't being dramatic. He was being accurate. When John Ross learned what had happened, he was furious. This wasn't a treaty. It was a fraud. A tiny minority of Cherokee had sold the homeland of an entire nation without any authority to do so. The Cherokee Constitution required the approval of the National Council for any land sale. The council had never met, had never voted, had never authorized anything. Ross immediately began organizing opposition. He gathered petitions. Nearly 16,000 Cherokee signed documents denouncing the treaty and demanding it be rejected. That was almost every Cherokee man, woman, and child who could sign their name. He took those petitions to Washington. He lobbied senators. He made speeches. He wrote letters. He did everything in his power to stop the treaty from being ratified. The debate in the Senate was intense. Even some senators who supported Indian removal thought this treaty was problematic. It clearly didn't represent the will of the Cherokee people. It had been negotiated with a tiny faction that had no legal authority. Ratifying it would be rewarding fraud. Senator Daniel Webster argued against ratification. Senator Henry Clay argued against it. The treaty was obviously illegitimate, they said. To honor it would make a mockery of the entire treaty-making process. The vote came in May of 1836. The treaty was ratified by a single vote, 31 to 15, the bare minimum needed for approval, 1 vote. If one senator had changed his mind, the treaty would have failed. The Cherokee would have had more time. The political situation might have changed. Andrew Jackson's term was ending. A different president might have taken a different approach. But that's not what happened. The treaty passed, and the countdown began. The Cherokee had 2 years. John Ross didn't give up. He kept fighting. He kept lobbying. He kept hoping that somehow something would change. The new president, Martin Van Buren, was Jackson's hand-picked successor, but maybe he could be persuaded. Maybe public opinion would shift. Maybe a miracle would happen. Meanwhile, the Treaty Party was already making plans to move west. They believed they were doing the right thing. They believed that voluntary removal was better than forced removal. They believed that by acting now, they could control the process, could ensure that the Cherokee Nation survived intact in its new home. Major Ridge and his family left for Indian Territory in 1837, a year before the deadline. They wanted to get there first, to stake out good land, to prepare for the rest of the nation to follow. Some Cherokee followed them, a few hundred families who shared their belief that resistance was futile. They made the journey on their own terms, with their possessions, their livestock, their dignity. But the vast majority stayed. They stayed because Ross told them to stay. They stayed because they believed justice would prevail. They stayed because these mountains were their home, the home of their ancestors, and leaving felt like dying. As 1837 became 1838, the situation grew more desperate. The 2-year deadline was approaching. The federal government was making preparations. Troops were being assembled, stockades were being built. Still Ross fought, still he lobbied, still he refused to accept that this was really happening, and still his people waited. Imagine what that was like, knowing that soldiers were coming, knowing that you had weeks, maybe days, before you'd be forced from your home at gunpoint, but not knowing exactly when, not knowing if you should plant your crops or start packing, not knowing if Ross's last-minute negotiations might somehow succeed. Some Cherokee families hid their valuables, burying silver and jewelry in the woods, hoping to come back for it someday. Some made arrangements with white neighbors to look after their property, trusting that somehow this would all be sorted out and they'd return. Some converted everything they could to cash and hid it in their clothing, knowing they might need it wherever they ended up. Some did nothing at all, paralyzed by uncertainty and fear. The Georgia lottery had already given away Cherokee land to white settlers. This was the cruelest twist. Before the Cherokee had even left, their farms and homes had been distributed to white families through a lottery system. Winners received title to specific plots of Cherokee land, complete with whatever buildings and improvements the Cherokee had made. Sometimes the lottery winners showed up while the Cherokee family was still there, waving their tickets and demanding that the occupants leave immediately. "This is mine now," they'd say. "I won it fair and square. Get out." One Cherokee woman described coming home to find a white family eating dinner in her house, using her dishes, sitting in her chairs, sleeping in her beds. They told her to get out. This was their home now. They had the papers to prove it. She had nowhere to go. So she stayed in the yard, in her own yard outside her own house, watching strangers live her life. That's what the spring of 1838 looked like. A nation in limbo, a people waiting for the axe to fall, a government that had done everything right, that had won in the highest court in the land, watching helplessly as that victory meant nothing. In May, the deadline arrived. The 2 years were up. The Cherokee who hadn't left voluntarily were now subject to forced removal. General Winfield Scott arrived with 7,000 soldiers, 7,000 armed men to remove a civilian population of about 14,000. Half of them women, half of them children. Scott issued a proclamation. The Cherokee had 1 month to prepare for removal, 1 month to gather their belongings, to say goodbye to their homeland, to accept that everything they'd fought for was lost. But the soldiers didn't wait a month. They started immediately. The roundups began in late May. Soldiers went from house to house, farm to farm. They gave families minutes to gather what they could carry. Sometimes not even that. Sometimes the soldiers burst in during dinner, ordered everyone out at bayonet point and marched them away with food still on the table. Children were separated from parents in the chaos. Elderly people who couldn't walk fast enough were prodded with rifle butts. Anyone who resisted was beaten. The Cherokee were taken to hastily constructed stockades, holding camps, collection points, 31 of them scattered across Cherokee territory. They were packed in with hundreds of other families, sleeping on bare ground, drinking dirty water, eating whatever the soldiers decided to give them. The camps had no sanitation to speak of, no shelter from the summer sun, no medicine, no privacy. Families who had lived in comfortable homes now slept in the dirt, surrounded by strangers, guarded by soldiers who saw them as problems to be managed. In Ross's house, Rose Cottage, soldiers arrived while his family was eating breakfast. They gave his wife Quati a few minutes to pack. Then they marched the family away. Ross himself was in Washington, still lobbying, still hoping. He wouldn't learn what had happened to his family for days. White looters followed behind the soldiers. They moved into the empty houses. They dug up the buried silver. They took the livestock, the furniture, everything that couldn't be carried. Sometimes they didn't even wait for the Cherokee to leave. They looted while the families watched, helpless to stop them. The stockades filled up through June and July. Thousands of Cherokee crammed into wooden pens in the summer heat. Disease spread like fire through dry grass. Dysentery first, from the contaminated water, then measles, then whooping cough. Children and elderly people started dying. Every day, new graves appeared outside the stockade walls. By some estimates, over 2,000 Cherokee died in the stockades before the march even began. 2,000 people. Gone. And the actual journey hadn't even started. And through it all, John Ross kept fighting, kept negotiating. He managed to get one concession. The Cherokee would be allowed to organize their own removal. They would march under their own leadership, in their own detachments, rather than being driven like cattle by the army. It was a small victory, but it was something, a last shred of dignity in the face of total defeat. The march was scheduled to begin in the fall, after the summer heat broke. The Cherokee would travel overland in groups of about 1,000 people each, 17 detachments in all. But they didn't know what was waiting for them. They didn't know about the winter that was coming, the harshest winter in anyone's memory. They didn't know how many more would die on the road. They didn't know that this march would become known by a name that would echo through history. They didn't know they were about to walk the Trail of Tears. But lying here in your warm bed, you know what's coming, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Just like John Ross, just like the Cherokee mothers holding their children in those stockades, just like the old men who had seen everything, who had survived smallpox and wars and broken treaties, and who now faced the end of everything they knew. Some things can't be stopped. Some tragedies are too big, too powerful, too backed by guns and greed and the indifference of those who could have helped, but chose not to. The Cherokee were about to learn that lesson in the cruelest possible way. The 1st detachment left on October 1st, 1838. About 1,000 Cherokee gathered from the stockades, organized into a long column and pointed west. They had wagons for the elderly and the sick. They had a few horses and oxen. They had whatever possessions they'd been able to grab when the soldiers came. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The route stretched over 1,200 miles, from the mountains of Georgia and Tennessee, across the Mississippi River, into the wilderness of Arkansas, and finally to Indian Territory in what would become Oklahoma. The journey was supposed to take about 3 months. It would take much longer than that. The Cherokee called it Nuna Dal Suni, the trail where they cried. John Ross had negotiated the right for the Cherokee to manage their own removal. It was a small victory, but it mattered. Instead of being driven like animals by the army, the Cherokee would march in organized detachments, led by their own people, with their own physicians and conductors. They would maintain whatever dignity they could. Ross put his brother Lewis in charge of organizing the logistics. They divided the Cherokee into 17 detachments of roughly 1,000 people each. Each detachment would leave a few days apart to avoid overwhelming the resources along the route. The plan was reasonable. The execution was a nightmare. The first problem was the drought. The summer of 1838 had been brutally dry. Rivers that the Cherokee needed to cross were too low for ferry boats. The detachments had to wait, sometimes for weeks, until water levels rose enough to continue. Then came the winter. The winter of 1838 to 1839 was one of the harshest in living memory. Temperatures plunged below zero. Snow fell in sheets, day after day, piling up on the roads and trails. The rivers that had been too low in the summer now froze solid, trapping ferries and stranding detachments on the wrong side for days at a time. The roads became rivers of frozen mud that sucked at wagon wheels and swallowed shoes whole. And the Cherokee kept walking. Picture it. Really picture it. A column of people stretching back for miles along a frozen road. Old men and old women who had never travelled more than a few miles from their birthplace, now walking 10, 12, 15 miles a day through freezing rain and snow. Their clothes were thin, meant for Georgia summers, not Arkansas winters. Their shoes wore out and weren't replaced. Some wrapped rags around their feet. Some walked barefoot through the snow. Mothers carried infants, trying to keep them warm against their chests, breathing on tiny fingers to keep them from turning black with frostbite. Children stumbled along, too tired to cry anymore, their eyes glazed, their feet leaving bloody prints in the snow. Old people collapsed and couldn't get up. Sometimes their families stayed with them. Sometimes the column just kept moving, because stopping meant dying. The wagons were supposed to carry the sick and the elderly, but there were never enough wagons. People who should have been riding had to walk. People who couldn't walk anymore sometimes crawled. People who couldn't crawl anymore were left to die. The rations were inadequate, salt pork and flour mostly, not enough of either. People were hungry all the time, hungry and cold and exhausted and sick. Disease travelled with them: dysentery, pneumonia, whooping cough, measles. People who had survived the stockades now fell ill on the road. There was no place to stop and recover. There was no medicine. There was only the trail stretching endlessly westward. Every day people died. The detachments carried their dead as long as they could, hoping to find a proper place to bury them. But sometimes there was no time. Sometimes the ground was too frozen to dig. Sometimes they had to leave bodies beside the trail, covered with rocks to keep the animals away, marked with whatever they could find. A private in the Georgia militia named John Burnett was assigned to escort one of the detachments. Years later, as an old man, he wrote down what he remembered. "I saw the helpless Cherokees arrested and dragged from their homes and driven at the bayonet point into the stockades," he wrote. and in the chill of a drizzling rain on an October morning, I saw them loaded like cattle or sheep into 645 wagons and started toward the west. He described what happened when winter hit. On the morning of November the 17th, we encountered a terrific sleet and snowstorm with freezing temperatures. And from that day until we reached the end of the fateful journey on March the 26th, 1839, the sufferings of the Cherokees were awful. The trail of the exiles was a trail of death. Burnett couldn't forget what he'd seen. Decades later, the guilt still haunted him. "Murder is murder," he wrote, "and somebody must answer. Somebody must explain the streams of blood that flowed in the Indian country in the summer of 1838. Somebody must explain the 4,000 silent graves that mark the trail of the Cherokees to their exile. I wish I could forget it all, but the picture of 645 wagons lumbering over the frozen ground with their cargo of suffering humanity still lingers in my memory. 4,000 silent graves. That's how many Cherokee died on the trail itself. Add the 2,000 who died in the stockades, and you're looking at 6,000 dead. Out of a population of 16,000, more than 1 in 3. And among the dead was Quati Ross. Quati was John Ross's wife, a full-blooded Cherokee woman who had been with him through everything. Through the building of Rose Cottage, their beautiful home that they'd never see again. Through the birth of their 5 children, through the endless trips to Washington where John had fought for their people while Quati kept everything running at home, through the Supreme Court victory that meant nothing, through the soldiers who dragged her from her breakfast table. She was in her 50s now, not young, not strong. The journey was killing her slowly, like it was killing so many others. But she refused to ride in the wagons while others walked. She walked alongside her people, sharing what little she had. Somewhere in Arkansas, in the bitter cold of the late January, Quati saw a sick child, a little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, shivering in her mother's arms with nothing to keep her warm. The child's lips were blue, her eyes were glassy. She was dying, and everyone could see it. Quati took off her own blanket, her only blanket, the one thing keeping her alive in the freezing wind. She wrapped it around the little girl. Someone tried to stop her, told her she needed that blanket, told her she'd freeze without it. Quati said the child needed it more. She got sick almost immediately. The cold sank into her bones and stayed there. Her cough got worse. Fever set in. Pneumonia. In the cold and the wet, with no medicine, no shelter, no way to get warm, pneumonia was a death sentence. Everyone knew it, including Quati. She kept walking as long as she could. Then she couldn't anymore. Quati Ross died somewhere on the trail, in the frozen wilderness between everything she'd known and everything that was supposed to come. Her husband wasn't there. He was travelling with a different detachment, managing the impossible logistics of moving 16,000 broken people across a continent. He learned of her death days later, through a messenger who had ridden hard to find him. They buried her beside the trail, one more grave among thousands, one more silent marker on the road of tears. The little girl Quati gave her blanket to survived. Or so the story goes. Her name was lost to history, but she lived. Quati's blanket kept her warm long enough to reach Oklahoma. John Ross would remarry years later. He would serve as principal chief for another 3 decades. He would guide his people through the Civil War and its aftermath. But people who knew him said he was never quite the same after Quati died. Something in him hardened, or maybe something broke. He never talked about her death. He kept it locked away, a private grief too big for words. The detachment straggled into Indian Territory through the winter and early spring of 1839. The last group arrived in March. They found a land that was nothing like the green mountains they'd left behind. Flat, dry, foreign. But they were alive, some of them anyway, and they were still Cherokee. The survivors tried to rebuild. They established a new capital at Tahlequah. They wrote a new constitution. They started new farms, new schools, new lives. John Ross was still principal chief, still trying to hold everything together, but the old wounds hadn't healed, and in June of 1839, they tore open in blood. The treaty party had arrived in Indian Territory a year earlier. Major Ridge, John Ridge, Elias Boudinot and their families had settled on good land near Honey Creek, started their farms, tried to make a new beginning. They knew they weren't popular. They knew some people blamed them for everything. But they thought the worst was over. They thought time would heal the wounds. They were wrong. On the night of June 21st, a group of men met in secret. They drew lots to determine who would carry out the executions. 3 targets, 3 teams, 3 deaths, all to happen at dawn. John Ridge was first. In the grey light before sunrise on June 22nd, about 25 men surrounded John Ridge's house. They broke down the door. They dragged him from his bed, past his screaming wife Sarah, past his terrified children. They pulled him into the yard, threw him face down in the dirt. Then they stabbed him, over and over, 25 men taking turns with their knives, making sure the blood was on all their hands, making sure no one man could be singled out as the killer. John Ridge died in his own yard, in front of his family, torn apart by his own people. He was 36 years old. The same morning, another group waited on a road in Arkansas, near the border of Cherokee Territory. They knew Major Ridge would be travelling that road. They hid in the trees and waited. When Ridge's horse appeared, they opened fire. 5 rifles, all at once. Major Ridge tumbled from his saddle, dead before he hit the ground. He was 68 years old. He'd spent his entire life fighting for the Cherokee, first with weapons, then with words, and in the end, neither had been enough to save him. That afternoon, Elias Boudinot was at his new home, working on construction. 4 men approached him. They said they needed medicine from the mission supply, asked if he could show them where it was kept. Boudinot walked with them toward the mission. Why wouldn't he? They were fellow Cherokee, neighbours in this new land. He had no reason to suspect anything. When they were far enough from the house that no one could see, they struck. One man drove a tomahawk into Boudinot's skull from behind. When he fell, the others stabbed him with knives. They left his body in the woods, split open and bloody. He was 36 years old, the same age as his cousin John Ridge, the man who had created the Cherokee Phoenix, who had given his people a voice, who had tried so hard to find a way forward. Dead in the dirt, killed by his own. The assassinations were carried out under the old blood law. The treaty party had sold Cherokee land without authorization. The penalty was death. The men who carried out the killings believed they were enforcing Cherokee law, avenging a crime that had cost their people everything. Stand Watie, Boudinot's brother, had been on the death list too, but someone warned him in time. He escaped and swore revenge. For the next several years, the Cherokee Nation tore itself apart in a low-level civil war. Treaty Party supporters against National Party supporters, assassination and counter-assassination, ambush and revenge, families destroyed, communities divided. Everything the Cherokee had built, everything they had suffered to preserve, seemed to be crumbling. John Ross worked desperately to end the violence. He called councils, he negotiated truces, he tried to bring the factions together to convince them that they were all Cherokee, that they had to stop killing each other if they wanted to survive. It took years, but slowly, painfully, the violence subsided. In 1846, a new treaty was signed that officially reunited the factions. The Cherokee Nation was one people again, scarred, traumatized, but together. They rebuilt. They established schools again. The Cherokee Male Seminary and the Cherokee Female Seminary opened in 1851, offering classical education to Cherokee youth. Students learned Latin and Greek, mathematics and literature. The Cherokee literacy rate remained among the highest in the region. They restarted their newspaper. The Cherokee Advocate began publishing in 1844, carrying on the tradition of the Cherokee Phoenix. News and politics and poetry, all in Cherokee and English side by side. They wrote new laws. They built new roads. They created new farms and businesses. Within a decade of the Trail of Tears, the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma was thriving again. It wasn't the same. How could it be? The mountains were gone. The sacred sites were gone. The graves of their ancestors were 1,000 miles away. An entire generation had been traumatized by horrors that would echo through their descendants for centuries. But they survived. They adapted. They rebuilt. That's the thing about the Cherokee. That's the thing about this whole story. No matter how many times the world knocked them down, they got back up. Smallpox killed 90% of them. They rebuilt. Wars and treaties took half their land. They rebuilt. The Trail of Tears killed 1 in 3. They rebuilt. The Trail of Tears wasn't the end of Cherokee history. It was another chapter. Another catastrophe survived. Another resurrection begun. Lying there in your comfortable bed, you might wonder how they did it. How anyone could endure what they endured and come out the other side still fighting, still building, still Cherokee. Maybe it was the clan system, that web of relationships and responsibilities that gave everyone a place and a purpose. Maybe it was the old stories, the ceremonies, the going to water rituals that connected them to something larger than their individual suffering. Maybe it was just stubbornness, a refusal to let the people who had done this to them win. John Ross led his people for another quarter century after the Trail of Tears. He guided them through the Civil War when the Cherokee once again found themselves caught between two warring powers. He fought for their rights in Washington until the very end. He died in 1866 at 76 years old. He'd been principal chief for almost 40 years. He'd seen his nation nearly destroyed and watched it rise again. He'd buried his first wife on a frozen trail in Arkansas and lived long enough to see his grandchildren grow up in a new homeland. His last words, according to some accounts, were about his people, about the Cherokee, about the nation he'd spent his life trying to save. The Cherokee Nation he left behind wasn't perfect. It still faced challenges. The Civil War had divided them again. Federal policies continue to threaten their sovereignty. The future was uncertain, but they were still here, still Cherokee, still fighting. And that's the real story. Not just the tragedy, not just the suffering, the survival, the resilience, the absolute refusal to disappear. From the misty mountains of their ancestors to the flat plains of Oklahoma, through disease and war and removal and civil conflict, the Cherokee endured. They're still here today, still a nation, still speaking their language, still telling their stories, including this one. The trail where they cried became the trail where they survived, and surviving They proved something that no amount of treaties or soldiers or broken promises could ever take away. They are the Anivuya, the principal people, and they will not vanish. The Cherokee had barely finished burying their dead when the next war found them. In 1861, the United States tore itself apart. North against South, Union against Confederacy, brother against brother, and once again, the Cherokee found themselves caught in the middle, forced to choose sides in a conflict that wasn't theirs. The old divisions resurfaced immediately. The wounds from the Treaty Party assassinations had never fully healed. 20 years of simmering resentment was about to boil over. Stand Watie, the man who had escaped assassination in 1839, had never forgotten, never forgiven. He'd spent 2 decades building his power base, nursing his grudge against John Ross and the National Party, waiting for his moment. When the Confederacy came calling, he saw his chance. Watie threw in with the South. He raised a regiment of Cherokee cavalry and became a Confederate officer. His men were fierce fighters, hardened by years of frontier conflict. They became legendary raiders, striking Union supply lines with devastating effectiveness, burning wagon trains, capturing prisoners, disappearing into the hills before reinforcements could arrive. Eventually, Watie would rise to brigadier general, the only Native American to achieve that rank in the Confederate Army. He was 60 years old and still fighting, still proving something to the men who had killed his brother and his uncle and his cousin. John Ross tried to stay neutral. He was 70, years old now, tired of wars, tired of watching his people die for other people's causes. He'd already buried one wife on a frozen trail. He'd already lost one homeland. The Cherokee had already lost everything once. He didn't want to lose it again. But neutrality wasn't an option. The geography made that clear. The Confederacy controlled the territory surrounding the Cherokee Nation. Union forces were hundreds of miles away, across hostile territory. Confederate agents made it very clear: sign a treaty with us, or face invasion. Ross signed. He had no real choice, but his heart was never in it, and everyone knew it. The Cherokee split down familiar lines. Watie's Treaty Party supporters went Confederate. Ross's National Party supporters were divided. Many, especially the full-blooded traditionalists known as the Pin Indians, secretly remained loyal to the Union. They wore crossed pins on their shirts as a sign to each other. What followed was another civil war within a civil war. Cherokee fighting Cherokee. Again. Families torn apart. Again. Towns burned. Again. By 1862, Ross had fled to Union territory, effectively abandoning the Confederacy. His house, Rose Cottage, was looted and burned. Everything he'd rebuilt after the Trail of Tears, gone. Stand Watie fought on until June of 1865, more than 2 months after Lee surrendered at Appomattox. He was the last Confederate general to lay down his arms, stubborn to the end. When the war ended, the Cherokee Nation was devastated. 1/3 of the population was dead or displaced. The infrastructure was destroyed. The farms were abandoned. The schools were closed. It looked like the Trail of Tears all over again, and the federal government made them pay for it. The Treaty of 1866 was punishment disguised as reconciliation. The Cherokee were forced to give up more land, including the Cherokee Outlet, a vast strip in present-day Kansas and Oklahoma. They were required to grant citizenship and land rights to their former slaves, the Cherokee freedmen. They had to allow railroads to cross their territory. The Cherokee accepted the terms. What else could they do? And once again, they rebuilt. The schools reopened. The Cherokee Advocate resumed publication. The farms came back to life. By the 1880s, the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma was thriving again. They had their own government, their own courts, their own police force. They collected taxes and built roads. They were, by any measure, a functioning nation. It couldn't last. It was never going to be allowed to last. The federal government had a new idea. They called it allotment. The theory, dressed up in the language of progress and civilization, was that Native Americans would be better off as individual landowners rather than members of communal tribal nations. Break up the reservations, divide the land into individual plots, give each native person their own farm. Then they could become proper American citizens, assimilated into the mainstream, their tribal identities dissolved like sugar in water. That was the theory. The reality was land theft on a massive scale. The Dawes Act of 1887 set the process in motion. Reformers called it a humanitarian measure. They said it would help Native Americans. Some of them probably even believed it. The Cherokee resisted as long as they could. They sent delegations to Washington. They argued that their government worked fine, thank you. They pointed out that they already had farms and businesses and schools. They didn't need saving. But by 1902, they were forced to accept allotment. Their communal lands were divided up. Each Cherokee citizen received an individual plot of about 160 acres. The surplus land, everything left over after allotments were distributed, was open to white settlement. Speculators and swindlers descended like vultures on a carcass. They used every trick they could think of. They got Cherokee landowners drunk and had them sign papers they didn't understand. They tricked illiterate Cherokee into making marks on documents that signed away their land. They used legal technicalities, corrupt judges, forged documents. They married Cherokee women specifically to get access to their allotments, then abandoned them once the land was secured. They convinced elderly Cherokee to name white friends as heirs. They declared Cherokee landowners mentally incompetent and had themselves appointed guardians. Within a generation, the Cherokee had lost most of the land they'd been given. Millions of acres passed from Cherokee hands to white ownership. The allotment system didn't help Native Americans. It stripped them of their remaining wealth and left them with almost nothing. In 1907, Oklahoma became a state. The Cherokee Nation's government was effectively dissolved. The principal chief became a ceremonial position, appointed by the President of the United States rather than elected by the Cherokee people. The courts were closed, the police force was disbanded, the nation that had survived so much was told it no longer existed. For the next 70 years, the Cherokee existed in a kind of political limbo. Historians call this period the Dark Ages of Cherokee history. Their government was gone, their land was fragmented and largely stolen, their sovereignty was suppressed by federal policy. On paper, the Cherokee Nation had essentially ceased to exist. But paper doesn't capture everything. Paper doesn't capture the grandmother teaching her grandchildren Cherokee words in the kitchen. Paper doesn't capture the families who kept gathering for ceremonies, even when the government said those ceremonies weren't supposed to happen anymore. Paper doesn't capture the stubborn refusal to forget. The Cherokee didn't disappear. They never disappeared. Not when disease killed 90% of them. Not when they were marched 1,000 miles at gunpoint. Not when their government was erased by bureaucratic fiat. They kept meeting, kept organizing, kept teaching their children the language and the stories, kept the ceremonies alive, even when they had to do it quietly, kept waiting for the world to change. In 1970, it did. Congress passed the Principal Chiefs Act, which allowed the 5 civilized tribes to elect their own leaders again for the first time in over 60 years. The Cherokee held an election. A new chief was chosen by the people, not appointed by Washington. 6 years later, in 1976, the Cherokee Nation adopted a new constitution. They established a modern government with executive, legislative, and judicial branches. They began rebuilding their institutions, reclaiming their sovereignty, becoming a nation again. In 2003, they ratified an updated constitution that remains in effect today. A government of the Cherokee, by the Cherokee, for the Cherokee, just like John Ross had envisioned nearly 2 centuries earlier. And then, in 2020, something remarkable happened. The Supreme Court took up a case called McGirt versus Oklahoma. The question was simple. Did Congress ever officially dissolve the Muscogee Creek Nation's reservation? The answer would determine whether state or tribal courts had jurisdiction over certain crimes. The court ruled that the reservation had never been dissolved. The land was still Indian country. It had been Indian country all along. 2 years later, the same logic was applied to the Cherokee. Their reservation, covering much of eastern Oklahoma, still existed. It had never been legally terminated. The Cherokee Nation wasn't just a cultural organization or a historical curiosity. It was a sovereign nation with territorial boundaries that had never been erased. It was Worcester versus Georgia all over again. Nearly 200 years later, the Supreme Court once again affirmed Cherokee sovereignty. But this time, the president didn't sneer about enforcement. This time, the ruling stood. Today, the Cherokee Nation is the largest federally recognized tribe in the United States. More than 400,000 citizens spread across the globe, though the heart of the nation remains in northeastern Oklahoma. A multi-billion-dollar economy built on everything from casinos to manufacturing to healthcare. Hospitals and clinics providing free medical care to Cherokee citizens. Schools teaching Cherokee language and culture to new generations. The syllabary that Sequoia created is still taught. Cherokee children still learn to read and write in the language of their ancestors, those 85 symbols that one determined man spent 12 years developing. There are immersion schools where kids grow up speaking Cherokee as their first language, learning to think in the tongue of their great-great-grandparents. There are apps and online courses and YouTube videos, all designed to keep the language alive for generations to come. The Cherokee Nation has its own marshal service, its own court system, its own tax commission. It issues license plates and regulates businesses and provides housing assistance. It does all the things a government does, because that's what it is. A government. A nation. In 2019, the Cherokee Nation appointed a delegate to the United States Congress, fulfilling a promise made in a treaty signed in 1835. Kim Teehee was nominated to represent Cherokee interests in Washington. It took nearly 200 years, but the promise made at New Echota, that cursed treaty that cost so many lives, that promise was finally being kept. Chuck Hoskin Jr. serves as principal chief today, elected by the Cherokee people just like John Ross was elected nearly 2 centuries ago. The government Ross built, the nation Sequoia gave a written language. The people who survived the Trail of Tears and everything that came after, they're still here, still governing themselves, still fighting for their rights, still Cherokee, and still telling their story. Lying there in your comfortable bed, think about what you've heard tonight. Think about the span of it. Thousands of years of history, dozens of generations, catastrophe after catastrophe. And through it all, survival. The Cherokee started in the misty mountains of Appalachia. They built towns and farms and a sophisticated civilization. They developed a clan system that governed their lives for centuries. They created ceremonies and stories and ways of understanding the world that connected them to each other and to the land. Then the Europeans came. Disease killed 90% of them. Wars took their land piece by piece. They adapted, learned new ways, built new alliances. They traded and fought and somehow kept going. When the Americans said they needed to become civilized to survive, they did it. They created a written language from nothing. They published a newspaper. They wrote a constitution. They built a republic. And it still wasn't enough. They were forced from their homeland at gunpoint. Thousands died on the trail. Everything they'd built was taken from them, so they built it again. In a new land, among people who had tried to destroy them, they rebuilt their nation, schools, farms, government, all of it, again. The Civil War tore them apart. They rebuilt. Allotment stole their land. They endured. Their government was dissolved. They waited. And when the chance came, they rebuilt again. One more time. Because that's what they do. That's who they are. The Cherokee are still here because they refuse to stop being Cherokee. Through every disaster, every betrayal, every attempt to erase them, they held on to who they were. They passed it down, generation to generation. Language, stories, ceremonies, identity. No law could take that away. No army could destroy it. No amount of suffering could break it. That's the story of the Cherokee. Not just tragedy, though there's plenty of that. Not just resilience, though, that's part of it too. It's a story about what a nation really is. Not land, which could be stolen. Not government, which can be dissolved. Not even people, who can be killed. A nation is an idea, a shared identity, a commitment to each other and to the generations that came before and the generations that will come after. As long as people hold on to that idea, the nation survives. The Cherokee held on. Through everything, they held on. And now, lying in your warm bed, in whatever town or city you call home, you're part of this story too. Because you listened, you learned, you carried this history with you for a little while, and now it's yours to remember. The Cherokee call themselves Anivwia, the principal people, the real people, the original people. They've earned that name 1,000 times over. Outside your window, the world is quiet now. The stories are finished for tonight. The history can rest for a while, and so can you. Think about those misty mountains if you want. Think about the sacred fires that never went out, even when everything else was lost. Think about sequoia scratching marks on bark year after year, refusing to give up. Think about Quaity giving her blanket to a cold child, knowing what it would cost her. Think about what it means to survive, what it means to rebuild, what it means to hold on to who you are when the whole world is trying to take it away. And then let it all go soft and hazy, like morning mist on ancient mountains. Let your breathing slow down. Let your thoughts drift. The Cherokee are still here, still telling their stories, still teaching their children, still remembering where they came from. And now you'll remember too. Sleep well. Dream of misty mountains and sacred fires. Dream of people who refuse to vanish. Dream of survival.